I know that I'm not alone in having a heavy heart today about two police officers that had their lives taken just simply doing their job. And so I wonder if we might just take a second to, for a moment of silence to recognize them. Thank you very much. Rob, you'll let me know when I can go ahead. We're good, thank you. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Councillor Mackey,
Present.
Councillor Gamble,
Present.
Councillor Burley,
Present.
Councillor Carlton,
Present.
Councillor McQueen,
Present.
Councillor Desai,
Present.
Councillor Patterson,
Present.
Warden Hicks,
Here.
Councillor Clumpus,
Here.
Councillor Keaveney,
Present.
Councillor Body,
Present.
Councillor O'Leary,
Present.
Councillor Woodbury,
Present.
Councillor Milne,
Present.
Councillor Soever,
Present.
Councillor Bordignon,
Present.
Councillor Robinson,
Present.
Councillor Hutchinson.
Present.
We have all members in attendance today.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'll next move to the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, the Six Nations of the Grand River, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wyandot peoples on whose traditional territories we gather and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We recognize also the Métis and the Inuit, whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all of its diverse peoples. Council, is there any declaration of interest, pecuniary or otherwise? Seeing none, I will just, my apologies. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and good morning, County Council. I am declaring a potential indirect interest on item number 9 on this agenda. Thank you.
Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and good morning, County Council. I am going to declare a potential interest, potential indirect interest, on item number 9 on this agenda as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else? I would just say if conflict of interest, you discover one in the course of the meeting, I would ask you to declare it at that time. Okay, item number 6, is adoption of the minutes. Dealing with 6A first, County Council and Committee of the Whole minutes dated September 22nd, 2022. I'm looking for a mover to put the item on the floor. Moved by Councillor Bordignon and seconded by Councillor Hutchison. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Item 6B is Committee of the Whole closed meeting minutes dated September 22nd, 2022. Need a mover, please. Moved by Councillor O'Leary. He's got a twitch in his eye, so I'll say him. And seconded by the Deputy Warden. Any discussion on those? All those in favor? Any opposed? That too is carried. Item C is the Long-Term Care Committee of Management minutes dated October 3rd, 2022. Need a mover, please. Moved by Councillor Burley and seconded by Councillor Keaveney. Any discussion on that? All those in favor? Any opposed? That too is carried. Item D, the Long-Term Care Committee of Management closed meeting minutes, which are dated October 3rd, 2022, moved by Councillor Mackey and seconded by Councillor Woodbury. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Item number 7 is reports. First, we have the Public Health Grey Bruce Board of Health minutes, which are dated August 26th, 2022. Do we have Dr. Era? I don't see him online. Oh, I see him in the list. There he is. Okay. I'll just get a mover to put the item on the floor first. Moved by Councillor Patterson and seconded by Councillor Clumpus. Dr. Era, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Orden. Good morning, Council. Thank you for having me. The board in the minutes received certain updates, most significant of which are the update on the emergency COVID pandemic and the recovery from the emergency. And the information at that time still consistent today with progression in a safe manner. We have the number of cases and the statistics, the epidemiology, all of it is reassuring as appropriate or as good as we can get it at considering the fall season. The situation with the vaccine continued to be favorable as well. We have clinics across Grey Bruce to provide the COVID vaccine, and although the situation is very stable, we still are ready to respond if there is a surge later in the fall or in the winter. On the other fronts of recovery, the opioid situation, our health unit continues to work and contribute to the local efforts to respond to this emergency. More or less, it's a type of emergency. And on the provincial front as well, we continue to lead a number of health units in the same effort. One of the updates to the board in the minutes was about the school health program, and that is directly related to the recovery and touches on many fronts, whether it's related to the vaccine or the opioid or others. And the recovery in this program has been optimal, I would say. And all in all, we continue to progress according to plan with recovery, healthy recovery, at the same time having preparedness in case there is a surge with the COVID situation. That's my update, Mr. Warden. Open to questions as always.
Thank you very much, Dr. Era. Are there any questions? Council? I see no questions. So Dr. Era, thank you very much for your time today. And council,
you.
all those in favor of the report? Any opposed? That is carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, we turn now to delegations. Is there a staff member? Kevin, are you going to make introductions of our delegates? Ah, yes. So there is a bit of a procedural thing here. We're moving into committee of the whole temporarily because that's just the way the agenda is working out today. So I need a motion to bring us into committee of the whole. Moved by Councillor Carlton, seconded by Councillor Burley. Kevin? Oh, sorry, we should vote. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? Oh, okay, excellent. That's carried. Sorry, Kevin?
Good morning, County Council. Good morning, Warden. I'm pleased to be here this morning with Andrew Gregan from Operational Research and Health, ORH. They're actually from across the pond in London, and they're here actually, they were here with the conference with us last week, and then also they're traveling throughout Ontario with other services as well. So it gives us the opportunity for them to be in person with us here. We've been working on this comprehensive deployment review since June. We brought this forward this year to look at where resources are needed and put us on a solid footing for the next 10 years. and looking at what our call volumes are going to look like. We see year over year increases, and what does that mean for us, not just now, and how we build to that in the next 10 years. So today we have looked at the results and they've done the analysis. What we want to do is provide that information to you and get your comments and feedback. And then in the next 4 to 8 weeks, we'll be coming up with some recommendations and bringing back a report and another presentation to council around that for consideration. And I just wanted to say thanks to Andrew and his team, Hannah, and all his work at his place, but also the number of people here from our CAO to deputy CAO, and then also to our finance and IT, GIS planning. Our dispatch has been involved, our paramedics and our management team. So everybody's provided input into this. So just wanted to say thanks to them as well. So I'll introduce you to Andrew, and we can take questions at the end or throughout, whatever Andrew's comfortable with. Thanks.
Great. Good morning, Council. Good morning, Warden. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. As Kevin just said, great to have the opportunity to be here in person and present to you today, rather than over a screen, which we've done a few too many times maybe in the last few years. So as Kevin said, today I'm just going to give you an overview of the review, give you some background about why I'm here, but also some of the key findings so far and where we are on that path, as Kevin said, to recommendations and the future picture for Grey County Paramedic Services. So I'll just go through a bit of an introduction, again, why I'm here, what exactly it is we're doing, some of the key analysis summaries from the work so far, talk about demand projections, what's that call volume going to look like in 10 years time and years in between. I'll go through some of the modelling scenarios we've undertaken so far to date to give an idea of a first kind of case of what things might look like, in the future, and then talk about some emerging results and kind of get a discussion there around next steps. So happy if there are any questions throughout, otherwise we can hold questions to the end. Either way is fine by me. So by word of introduction, what we've been asked to do is create a comprehensive master plan for paramedic services for the next 10 years, so through to 2033. That will include a written report with an executive summary, presentation to council, again like this, but with more recommendations at a later date. And there are 5 main components to the review. When we're thinking about what does the paramedic service look like in 10 years' time, first thing, obviously, we need to understand how many calls we're expecting in 10 years' time. Difficult to predict, but something we need to do, and I'll come on to more detail on that. We also need to look at response time targets, so understanding not only what the call volumes look like, but how quickly are we going to be able to respond to patients, and therefore how many resources, how many staff, how many vehicles, where should they be in order to get that best response for the patient, given those call volumes and given those response time targets. That leads us into the facilities model. Again, where should stations be? How large should they be to make sure we're gearing ourselves up for the next 10 years to make sure we have the right capacity where we need it to make sure we serve the patients well. And this review also includes the handover of the modelling tool. I'll come into a little bit more detail on what I actually mean by modelling. We use a modelling tool that we've developed in-house for paramedic services across our work across the world. We're actually handing that over, and we had a training session yesterday to kind of start to get an idea about how to use that tool. That's really key, being able to use it in-house to answer questions, as well as us having the same tool back in the UK. That seems to be a good way of working from our experience. So who are ORH? Who am I? So I'm from ORH Operational Research and Health, as Kevin said, and we are from across the pond in the UK. We work predominantly with emergency services. Almost all of our work is with emergency services, and within that, a lot of work is with paramedic services or ambulance services across the world. Some work also with fire services and police services too. What we try to do is help those services understand the picture of what's going on, but also set them up for the future to make sure they're responding in the most effective and efficient way. We work a lot in the UK, work with most of the services in the UK, quite a few services now within Ontario. We've worked with most of your neighbouring services, a bit of work in BC a few years ago, and some work in Australia too. So hopefully be able to bring international best practice to the review. We've also partnered in this review with the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives, who are kind of the UK equivalent of the Ontario Association of Paramedic Chiefs. So a kind of governing body effectively for ambulance services in the UK. They also, again, provide that international best practice experience from their countless experience in various reviews across the world, and particularly in the UK. Just like to talk through so far what we've undertaken and what we've understood from the analysis section of the review. So we undertook quite a detailed data collection process, as we would do in one of these reviews, collecting 5 years and actually back to 2011 in terms of call volume data, so line by line data about all the calls that have come in, ultimately to 911 and requiring some kind of response from Grey County Paramedic Service. That allows us to then look in depth at lots of different things, and I've just shown some highlights here. First one here, hopefully you can see this graph. So this shows us in the red line, the code for demand call volumes by month. And we're talking here in terms of incidents. So effectively, one number is one patient. Code 4 is red. That's the highest priority, the life-threatening emergencies. There's also code 3, more urgent type calls, and then code 1s and code 2s, which are kind of transfer type calls. What we can see here is, unsurprisingly, right in the middle of your screen, there is a dip there around, obviously, the start of the pandemic, and something we've seen across services we worked with across the globe. But then actually call volumes rebounded relatively quickly. And actually, if you look at the kind of right-hand side, of the graph, you can see that call volumes are actually increasing. Incident numbers are increasing year on year. Again, something similar, a fairly typical pattern from what we've seen in other Ontario services. One key difference or something that's relatively unique to Grey County is the difference in demand by season, particularly in the Blue Mountains. Obviously, we know there is the Blue Mountain Ski Resort has a much higher demand. We can see there in that top left number, 6.9 incidents a day. In the winter season, in the summer season, it's more like three incidents a day. So twice as many call outs effectively for paramedic service in that area in the winter. Not something we really see in any of the other municipalities, but something definitely to be aware of. You know, how does that resourcing picture need to change perhaps, or need to be different in the Blue Mountains at different times of year that maybe isn't quite the same in other areas? One of the key conversations I think we have around the world really is around offload delays and the time spent at hospital. I would say we've got some benchmarking slides in a few moments' time. Offload delays don't seem to be a large problem in Grey County, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't monitor them and look at how they're trending. What this graph, very complicated though it is, shows is you can see a large rise in that dark blue line around the middle of the screen around the COVID-19 pandemic. And that hasn't really reduced since then. And what that's showing us is the amount of time on average an ambulance spends at hospital in Owen Sound. It is longer in Owen Sound than it is in some of the other hospitals within Grey County. We've also got data on this for those calls where paramedic service goes to somewhere like London or maybe Kitchener for a transfer, where the offload delays tend to be even greater. So I would say not a huge problem from our experience in Grey County compared to some other areas, but clearly an increase around the pandemic and a continued slight upward trend for particularly for Owen Sound. So something to monitor when we're thinking about what does that look like in 10 years time, or even in a couple of years time. Just because offload delays don't present a significant challenge at the moment doesn't mean we shouldn't look at those. Just wanted to talk about performance a little bit too. So here we are showing the CTAS 1 to 5 performance, so the Canadian Triage Acuity Scale. CTAS 1 being the highest acuity, including sudden cardiac arrests within those numbers. We're just showing this here for the code 4s, the dispatch code 4s, so the life-threatening emergency calls. CTAS 1 volumes are relatively low, unfortunately, and that's what we would expect. But Grey County Paramedic Services have, over the sample period, met their response time standards of 8 minutes, 60% in 8 minutes for those CTAS 1s, if I focus on that number. But what we can see, hopefully highlighted by the red and the green at the bottom there, is within that, although we're meeting 64% within 8 minutes, above our 60-minute target, it's a lot higher in Hanover and Owen Sound, the more urban municipalities, rather than somewhere like Southgate maybe, or Grey Highlands. So we know there is a different response, and that is a call volume issue, or not issue, is a call volume factor is also a kind of density of those call volumes factor as well, and the resourcing required to meet different standards in different areas. So what we've done in this review is looked at different responses in different areas and different response time standards. It's definitely something we'll be thinking of when we're thinking about 10 years time. What's that right level of response in different areas, and how does that mix with the relative rurality and the need to cover quite a large geographical area? This hopefully shows that also in map form. This is just for code 4s again. So the response time here, we're showing the darkest green is the best response time effectively, and unsurprisingly, they are around existing stations. We do see that there are some green areas around some of the standby points between stations when the deployment plan comes into play, and maybe there are reduced vehicles and then moved to a central point. Good example there is Allen Park or maybe Flesherton also. And it might be a little hard to pick out on the slide, but there are kind of grey circles or blobs in the background. That's the actual kind of call volume underlying this picture. So generally what we see, as we'd hope to see and as we'd expect, is that the green areas have the highest call volumes. Some of the areas with the lower response times, or longer response times, sorry, do have relatively low call volumes, but they are relatively large areas, particularly in Southgate and Grey Highlands. So low call volumes, longer drive times, and therefore generally longer response times. One thing we've looked at is the workload of different vehicles and different crews effectively in different stations, and how that differs across Grey County. Unsurprisingly, Owen Sound has the most responses out of that station, also has the most crews based at that station. What we've looked at here, though, on the right-hand side is, of those responses, what proportion are different codes? The very right-hand side shows that code 8, which is a standby move. So that is not a kind of patient carrying response, if that makes sense. That's a move to optimally cover Grey County when there are maybe few vehicles because the vehicles are busy with other patients. So making sure you cover some of those maybe more red areas or areas in between stations. So we see that the workload is very different in Owen Sound. There's a lot more patient carrying responses, code 1 to 4, particularly code 4. And Hanover 2, when we get down to Chatsworth, Durham, Dundalk, those stations actually spend slightly more than half their time actually moving on standby moves between stations, so making sure that coverage is supplied effectively across the county. That's something we're going to be looking at, is what is that right level of balance between those patient carrying responses and the need to cover, again, quite a large geographical area. One thing we've done, I mentioned, we've worked with quite a few neighbouring services in Ontario and also some others. We've got data from those reviews, and it's analysed in the process we undertake in the same way for each review, so we can then compare some other services and different parameters in other services to Grey County. We want to understand, are there any clear outliers in terms of maybe time at scene is longer, or time at hospital might be longer in some areas than others. We've undertaken this benchmarking, and I think it's fair to say that there aren't really any clear outliers for any of the parameters in Grey County. You tend to sit relatively in the middle of the services we've worked with, or towards the better end. Within this as well, we have only shown the more rural Ontario services we work with, or maybe slightly mixed services, so some of your surrounding areas. We're not comparing to some of the more urban areas that we've worked with. It's obviously not really a fair comparison. So I would say, not really anything that jumps out at us as being a clear outlier from our experience to then test, what if this could be improved? Just an example of that, where you do sit pretty much right in the middle of the pack. This shows the amount of time spent on scene. So clearly the longer the amount of time spent on scene may have a benefit for patients, but it's taking up that resource for a longer time, which means you maybe lack coverage in some areas. Grey County actually sitting right in the middle of some of the services we've worked with. So not really anything suggesting there that we should be testing out what if that could be improved. Similarly, I said offload delays weren't a kind of significant problem from our experience compared to other services in Grey County. This graph here shows the total time at hospital. Grey County are in blue there. Sorry, I should have mentioned on the previous slide. And the darker part of that graph is the time from arrival through to offload. The lighter part is the offload through to clear and being available for another call. If you look at where that kind of darker part of the blue bar sits, that's one of the lowest, and actually the total bar is actually lower than a lot of other services offload delays. So before they even actually offload the patient in Grey County, you'd be clear, ready for the next job. So hospitals here not producing a significant offload delay problem. But again, worth bearing in mind that we have seen that offload delay increase over the last couple of years. So not a problem at the moment, but something to think of in future and be aware of. So one thing we've looked into, and one thing we need to understand how the paramedic service, or what it looks like in 2033, so obviously everything I've just shown you there so far is historical data. There's nothing about the future within that. Maybe some things we can see and think about, but nothing that actually looks to the future. So we use a demand projection methodology we've used in quite a few different services across the world, and it's our kind of go-to approach that works well, and we've tested against, coming back to a service a few years later and testing out actually has our prediction held relatively true. And that method is an age and gender based method. So we collected population data, both historical and future. We collected a lot of historical demand data. We're then able to look at what is the demand rate per head or per 1,000 people, and how does that differ maybe by municipality, by year, and also importantly by age and gender group. So a patient in one area may provide or require a different amount of response to another area, and also the demographics are different in different areas. We then forecasted those demand rates forward through to 2033, and then combined it with the population projections from Henson and Ministry of Finance. And just wanted to echo Kevin's words, really great support from ITGAS and planning in terms of getting that information to us in a format that was really useful for us. So thanks very much to your colleagues. There are three main factors, therefore, in our demand projections for the future. There's maybe the change in total population, and that is definitely something we're aware of, particularly in the Blue Mountains, a large population change projected there in the future and has been occurring in the past. There's also the aging population. As people get older, tend to be in the Western world, we tend to have an aging population. It might differ in different municipalities, but overall. And there's also what we see, the increasing demand rate per head. So even per person over the years, people are slightly more likely every year to require paramedic service assistance. I've just got a couple of examples of that in a second. This is a population pyramid showing in the bars on the left-hand side, the darker purple, the male, and on the right-hand side, the lighter purple, the females for 2021. A relatively aged population, if that's the right term. The bulk of population is within that kind of 50 to 75 age bracket. It's then interesting, though, when we look to the lines on the kind of outer side, those are the projections for 2033. So effectively, unsurprisingly, what we're seeing is that age group, that bulk of the age group, they're shifting up as obviously time moves on. We do see some increases around younger ages too that we would expect. But generally, a kind of upward trend in terms of aging population. And that's really important when we think about the different demand rates that we've seen in Grey County, and typically this is quite typical of other work we've done across Ontario, but also in the UK, is we've looked here at the historical and projected demand rates per 1,000 people by different age groups. And I think what will stand out to you is that right-hand side. That right-hand side is the demand rate for 75 plus aged people. And what that's telling us is in 2022, there are around 350 calls per 1,000 people in a year from that age group. And then, but that's been increasing over the years, and that's projected to then increase to around 700 calls per 1,000 people in 2033. And if we think to that previous graph, there's also more people now in that age group. So that's really one of the key factors in driving future call volumes. And again, something that's fairly typical of work we do across really the Western world. We've also been able to, again, thanks to GIS, IT and planning, take into account not only demand levels by municipality, but also within municipalities, what are the expected developments? Where's the growth really going to be at a more granular level? So this here just shows some examples. Owen Sound not quite shown on the map here, but they are included. What we're showing here is the darker the kind of areas you can see, particularly if we take around Craigleith in the Blue Mountains. That's a a larger area of expected development in future. More units are projected to be built there in future. That lakeshore area is a particular area of growth. Also in Georgian Bluffs around Cobble Beach, but also there are areas dotted throughout the county really where we are expecting developments to occur. And what we're able to do with that information is not only we know that people already live where they live and work where they work and generate demand for the paramedic service wherever they may be, but actually maybe that's shifting, maybe that's going to grow more in a certain area than it is in existing areas. So take into account where there might be very local volumes at the moment and kind of greenfield land, and then project in some future demand there to make sure we're understanding what the picture looks like in future. What that then results in terms of a total headline kind of figure for demand projections for Code 3 and Code 4 incidents is a 5.8% increase per year projected through to 2033. It's broadly similar to what we've seen over the past 10 years or so at around 6.5%. You can obviously see quite a bump pre-pandemic and then a dip around the pandemic, but quickly returning to kind of historical levels. It is always very difficult to project demand because, as I've just said, some years you might have a 10% increase, some years you might have a very small, a 1% increase, for example. We tend to find that on average, this projection method works well, but there will be years that are higher or lower, and that's something, particularly with the modelling tool, Grey County Paramedic Services should be able to react to when things start to seem busier, maybe in a year than we perhaps predicted in the first place. And also with that model, we're able to test out, okay, what if it's not 5.8% a year? What if it's 3.8% a year, picking that number out there, or 7.8? What if that number differs because something changes? We need to be ready for that to make sure if that does happen, we understand what might need to change across Grey County. There's no use focusing on one number, and if that number doesn't happen, that's everything fallen over. And we have, as I said, projected it by municipality. Blue Mountains, unsurprisingly from our kind of experience and knowledge here, having the highest both historical projected demand increase and also future projected demand increase. The majority of the other municipalities around similar kind of levels, Blue Mountains stands out a little. So then just going to talk through again, thinking more about the future rather than what's happened in the past. First, want to just quickly run through what we mean when we say modelling. It's a term that's used across lots of different types of work and in lots of different ways. The benefits of our modelling approach, we feel, are that the paramedic service, any paramedic service, is a very complicated system. Right now, there's lots of things going on, lots of human behaviour, and lots of things happening at the same time. You can't take a kind of relatively simple approach in a spreadsheet, for example. You need a full simulation model to replicate exactly what happens in that really complex real world system. You can also, though, then test multiple ideas quickly in a safe environment. So rather than running a pilot or a trial about something you think might be right, and maybe it is, you can actually test it out in a kind of sandbox computer model to make sure before you maybe go live with that change, are you getting the right numbers? Are you getting the right outcomes for patients? We can also identify, and we've got a slide in a moment, around some optimal solutions. So where are the optimal locations for stations across Grey County if we could just pick them up and put them wherever we want? That's something we always tend to do to get a picture of that. I'll come on to that in a moment. We can also overcome some limitations of analysis. It's a very complex system, like I just said. Lots of things may happen. You may have days with much higher offload delays or call volumes. We can then, in the model, unpick that and identify which things are driving those changes. Also gives you an evidence base for this kind of consultation. It gives you a list of priorities based on that modelling, based on that evidence to go forward with. You should hopefully be able to see a little bit there in the background. That's our simulation model itself. It is a bespoke model for ambulance services, but it's set up in this case for Grey County Paramedic Services, and it uses all of the data and all of the analysis and more than what I've just shown you in a few slides. The first thing we do is set it up to make sure it's reflecting the real world as closely as possible. That's a very difficult process. It is a computer simplification of the real world problem, but it's the best tool we have to be able to understand and replicate what's going on in the real world. It's not perfect, but it's as close as we can possibly get it. Once we're happy with that, based on our experience, we can then test out lots of different what-if scenarios. Two main scenarios I'll quickly just go through today are that question I mentioned a second ago, where are the optimal locations across Grey County? And also what happens if nothing changes other than demand increases through to 2033? Not a scenario we hope happens, but we need to understand that as a baseline of here's our expected call volume increase. What does that mean if nothing else happens in terms of resourcing changes, for example? So first map here, you probably won't quite be able to see, but the grey diamonds on the map are the existing 8 bases across Grey County, and there are also some yellow diamonds on the map. What we've done here is take out all of those existing bases, put in the patient volumes across Grey County and say, okay, if we wanted 8 bases, where should they be located across the county to get the best performance possible? And a really good news story here is that they are very close to existing bases. There's one slight caveat to that around the model identifying a base potentially in Thornbury over Chatsworth, but that's something we've tested out in the simulation model, and that's actually something that doesn't provide a benefit to patients. So something for us to check there, but actually the Chatsworth base providing a better response to Grey County overall than moving it to Thornbury. Also a really good result is that even with the new development information built in for the future and future demand levels where we expect them to be, those bases don't actually move. So even if all the developments come to fruition by 2033 as expected, the existing base locations are in a really good location to provide response to patients across Grey County. And that's also true if we include not only Grey County responded demand, but also some of the demand that maybe Guelph Wellington, for example, in Southgate respond into in Southgate. If we include that demand too, actually doesn't change the location of stations. So quite a key result there that shows maybe there's some slight movements, and if there were areas where you had to move station for whatever reason, we could have identify if there's something 500 meters down the road, whatever it might be. But it's showing us that really no change needed for the future based on the assumptions we've made here. A lot of numbers on this slide, so I'll just focus on some of the key ones. This shows us the do nothing position in 2033. So that demand projection I showed you a few slides ago, if we put that into our model and don't change anything else, so you've got existing resources across Grey County, what actually happens? There's a fall, unsurprisingly, in performance as things get busier. And now we're under 50% within 8 minutes, whereas we were over 60% for those code 4 calls. And within those are the CTAS1 and sudden cardiac arrest type calls. Ambulance utilization as well goes from around 17% on patient carrying calls through to around 36%. So not far off doubling how busy resources are. And that differs a bit by station as well. So clearly you put in 10 years of demand, things get busier, resources get busier and performance falls. Not a recommendation or an outcome we'd be suggesting that we'd hope would happen, but it gives us that baseline of, okay, if nothing did change, where would we be? We also modeled that in by year, and I just wanted to point out on this slide, it's not a straight line. So as things get busier, the impact gets greater every year. We add more and more demand as things get more and more stretched. So it's not just as simple as this many calls equals this performance fall. It depends where we are in the future. And that's something that, again, we're able to model in there to understand when do we need to intervene perhaps in future. Just then focus on a few emerging results. So as when Kevin during his introduction, said, we are now kind of working through okay, we've got the do nothing position in future and we understand what things look like there, but what do we then need to do in terms of recommending where potentially resources might be located and optimizing what you currently have to meet that demand in future. There is the need though, given particularly in some areas, those developments driving quite high demand, and need to kind of monitor how those developments come in and how also demand increases come in. We are, still working in a very different world to pre-2020. So there is more uncertainty probably than there would have been in that period, and need to monitor that demand increase year on year. And that's where the modeling tool we have and now Grey County have comes into play, and be able to test out what's the impact of that. Similarly, monitoring offload delays, as I said, although they're not a significant challenge at the moment, if they continue to increase, they could present more of a challenge in future. So something to be aware of. There's also a much bigger, question around particularly in Grey County, the role of the first response unit, the solo crewed vehicle. Generally, more solo crewed vehicles across Ontario should some of the changes we know that may be happening in future around introducing MPDS and changes to the dispatch centre happen. There may be then a different role for that solo responder paramedic in the future, and that's something that we know from our work in the UK can work very well. So that was quite a quick run through of all of the slides I have to date. Obviously, quite a high level picture of lots of different detailed things we've looked into. So happy now to hand over if there are any questions. Hopefully, we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Council, any questions? Deputy Warden McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden and County Council, and thank you very much for your presentation. I know there's been some discussion, I guess it goes back to the CTIAS 1 to 5 performance for code 4, and certainly Chatsworth and Great Highlands sort of are at the lower part of or a longer response time. And then if you look at response time in the mapping, it does show, we've talked about this on the east side of Grey County as a bit of a hole. But the uniqueness of that is it's called a Niagara Escarpment, which does delay access to certain calls. I know there was a particular snowball accident a few years back where that was an issue. But you're going back to your blank canvas, you're talking about the continued growth in the Blue Mountains. Is there or could there be a consideration of a future site? I'm looking at new development lands, or I'm looking at the map where you hit the blank canvas with the yellow from Chatsworth to Blue Mountains. Could there be a possibility of a site or a roving site, sort of maybe the southern part of Blue Mountains, northern part of Grey Highlands, just because there's a bit of a hole there? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, is the answer to that question. We have already thought and identified that area as a potential area for somewhere we'd like to test out some kind of different response in that area, be that a new base or a maybe a roving resource, because you are right, when we show that map, that's one of the key areas where there is more red than elsewhere. And I think one of the things we've also looked at is not only the percentage within 8 minutes, but what's the 90th percentile. So 10% of people wait longer than that number. That is longer in Grey Highlands and Southgate too, than some of the other areas. So definitely something we need to be aware of. There are lots of approaches to, if you wanted to hit a performance target in future, there are lots of different ways you can get to that performance target across Grey County. We've got to make sure that we provide a kind of fair and balanced approach for the citizens of Grey County, rather than necessarily going for the option that puts lots of resources in one place and doesn't change anything anywhere else, because that's not providing that kind of level of equity. Though we do also know there's obviously a drive time and coverage issue. So yes, definitely something for us to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Just to follow up on that, and this is where I said about a roving station or a redeployment through seasons. Certainly, Blue Mountains sees a bigger influx in the winter months. So does Grey Highlands in itself, and we do have probably close to 1,400 seasonal residents that do come into that area. So, I just wondered in the short term, and probably this is happening, is just in the sense of, I know at the base of Blue Mountain, they certainly focus more ambulance during that time, but just that area is more recreational base, and that seems to be where it probably reflects a little bit more on your influx on demand by season. How Blue Mountains and then other areas, including Grey Highlands, is a little higher during and Meaford as well. So we have a uniqueness here in Grey County where it's just not as stable. Everybody just goes to work and comes home. There's a lot of movement of different situations, and as long as you're sort of keeping that in tune. So thank you.
Councillor Mill.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and thank you, sir, for the reports. Very comprehensive. I did enjoy reading through it. My question is in response or in regards to the standby points. And does your modeling allow you to move those standby points around to see if there is is there any measurable impact to actually moving them? As my colleague suggested in, Eastern Grey Highlands or in the center of Southgate, does that have an impact there or a measurable impact?
Thank you for your question, councillor. Yes, that's something that our model takes into account. So to start with, we reflect the kind of coverage plan that already exists for Grey County. So maybe when there are, there's only one vehicle available across two stations, you post yourself to a central point to kind of cover both. We can also change that as well. So we can change that behavior in terms of the number of vehicles when you start to move, or where those locations actually are in terms of where vehicles might be moved to. So yes, something we can investigate in terms of, is there a response point, and where is the optimal response point in that kind of area in particular, and other areas too, that could be deployed to provide greater coverage. So yes, it's in the model. At the moment, it's kind of reflecting what currently happens, and then we can change and test and provide results as to show which options have a benefit and maybe which options maybe don't. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'll go with Councillor Mackey first.
Thanks very much, Mr. Warden. Thanks for the presentation. I was glad to see that there is a negligible effect if you did move the Chatsworth base over to Thornbury. So thanks for that. Just wondering about the offload delays and how they are affecting our overall abilities to get our buses back in service, and how that increase, and how do we minimize that? Is that a hospital emergency situation that we need to deal with? Thanks.
Thank you, councillor. Yeah, great question. That is a question we face, as I said, not just in Grey County, but across the work we do. So in terms of how it affects the response times ultimately, and utilization of crews and things like that, in the model at the moment, we've got the kind of past 2 years of offload delays and variations within that when we've seen it increase. But we can and will be testing out, what if that returns to, let's say, pre-COVID levels? If we get a reduction in offload delays, what does that mean in terms of then greater availability for resource, resources becoming free at hospital a little earlier than before? And what does that then mean for that next patient who requires a response, or getting back to base, ending shift early, getting to meal breaks on time, those kind of things. So something we'll definitely be looking into. We've already started kind of looking into. Also, conversely though, if things get worse, if we projected that increase to the future, what does that do in terms of making your resources busier and therefore your performance worse? That's something we can test out and evidence as well. In terms of that next piece around, okay, what do we do with that information? I think it's hopefully that evidence is there to kind of inform conversations with hospitals around managing as best as possible. Clearly, hospitals have their own capacity challenges too, and challenges in the health sector globally at the moment. But having that evidence to show, actually, if we did return to pre-pandemic levels, or if things did get worse, what does that mean for Grey County paramedic services? It means you need this many more crews, or whatever that number might be. Hopefully starts to provide evidence of that conversation to help things improve. In the UK, we've done a lot of work where we've got a really regional problem with offload delays in certain areas. And there's been a lot of work done with something called hospital ambulance liaison officers, which are a ambulance service provided member of staff that goes into the ED to kind of better manage that flow as best as possible to get the ambulance free to then respond to the next call. So there's a lot of work being done that we could definitely share in terms of background evidence and reviews of that, not done by ourselves, but other colleagues, into what's the impact of that may definitely be of use for the future and potential. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just to let you know, like Greybury South Services on Sound is where we see it the most. That's where we take most of our patients. And what you look at there is an average, but there are days where you could have somebody on a stretcher for 2 or 4 hours, which is a big impact to trucks sitting out of service for that period of time. But we have a great partnership with them. We work with them. We have like a fit to sit model, where if there are people that can be moved to the waiting room, offloaded, working with the triage nurse and the crew, that's being done. There's times where we have an extra stretcher in the hospital as well, that we can double up patients with one crew. And our supervisors regularly involved helping, because there are times where even though it doesn't meet our deployment plan to move a non-emerge transfer, if we're able to move a non-emerge transfer out, that we can create a space for a bed. So there's some things like that that it really is a personal relationship on a daily basis to be able to move some of this along. And we do have an overcapacity agreement with the hospital. If they get to a point where they are over capacity, that the charge nurse can divert to other hospitals for CTAS 3 to 5 as long as it's safe to do so. So there are a number of things that we're doing right now to help mitigate that.
Thanks, Kevin. I think that probably answered most of my next question. If there was an emergency, call went out though while you're sitting for 2 to 4 hours at the hospital, are you able to unload then and dispatch to that emergency call?
There we go. No, we're not. So once we're with that patient, we have to remain with that patient. We're technically out of service. So we look after that patient. We're responsible for that patient during that period of time. Now, if there was something major happen, there's always sometimes we're able to work things out. You know what I mean? I would like if there's a major car accident, I'm sure they would put people like wherever they could put them, move staff. They've always been really good, but technically that truck that's sitting on offload, they are not even called for an emergency call because they're not available. So we will bring resources into the city from other areas, and they'll be back to midway points, standby points, other areas. So we say that when we meet with the hospitals. I always use a scenario in Toronto, 625 square kilometers. There's 110 ambulances in that area. And in Gray, we have 4,500 square kilometers, and we have 9 ambulances and a first response unit. And like one station area is the size of Toronto. And so when we have 2 ambulances sit on offload, it's a significant hit to us. So like proportionately, and again, they have a volume problem. We have a area problem and sometimes a volume problem, and that's kind of what we face, and we are getting busier.
Okay, Councillor McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Great discussion. And I think for future, you got this Councillor said there from Chatsworth that, offloading is an issue. And we have growth, we have aging population, and we have a lot of events happening in Grey Highlands. And I know we probably follow, it's good to get to know what those are. So I wonder, bricks and mortars cost a lot of money. And I wonder if a future consideration is an extra ambulance that is more or less one that can move around throughout to sort of, it's sort of like any business, you maybe increase your equipment size, but you don't necessarily build more buildings until you get more equipment. So I just wonder if that's something that's considerable that it's seasonal with regards to offloading, as has been said. So I just wonder if that's a future consideration, and instead of bricks and mortar, like OPP are doing a lot more out of their car instead of having bricks and mortar. It's like a moving office. The same idea is having an extra ambulance. Is that something that would be considered to consider or to take in consideration of all the points that you have raised and increased growth and all that kind of stuff, and maybe add a little bit to one of the buildings, but not necessarily put a new location, because that costs a lot of money. Thank you.
Well, Andrew and I both can answer that. I just know, like for a place for somebody to be for 12 hours out on the side of a road somewhere or parked in a parking lot, it's a long day. If you're not, especially if call volumes are low, it's a tough decision about whether you build a base or if it's like a long-term commitment for there. And it's just tough to not have a place for them to go and clean up and do their documentation. And as a temporary thing to get coverage. I know when Chatsworth was first we're moving in that direction. We put somebody down at the Chatsworth Depot on the weekends. It was hard to get people there to, there's not really a place for them to be. It's difficult. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's definitely not good for staff. Yeah, well, there's no Tim Hortons out there. So Mr. Andrew, I can speak to that.
I think I'd agree. There is a balance between that coverage, also clearly staff welfare, and ultimately, I guess, patient experience. If it's challenging to provide that completely roving resource without a base when call volumes are low, because it's still roaming quite a large area, and it may be, even though it's moving, it's unfortunately at that time moving in the wrong direction. So it's possible to test out, though probably difficult to, I guess, feasibly undertake in reality. There could perhaps be something, I guess, in between, whereas it's a less traditional bricks and mortar station, but a kind of base is something that has worked in other countries, at least, in terms of some kind of post with facilities and enough facilities to get that kind of crew welfare taught to that point. So maybe something, I guess, in between the two, rather than what you'd say would be a traditional kind of bricks and mortar station, but something we can test out in the model, definitely.
Just when you talk about Grey Highlands and some of the challenging areas, one thing with ORH, they actually drove the county. Like, we went to all those challenging areas. We drove through Kimberley. We're up to Cobble Beach. We were down in Southgate. We went to all the different places in between. We toured every base. So they're aware of the geography. They know what that looks like. We can't get there from here type scenario. And so, like, yeah, I really appreciated that they looked at that. I took them for half the road that way, so I know they are pretty good.
So just 1 second, I do want to move things along. I don't want to stifle conversation. There is a report coming back in January, is my understanding. And so I'll allow you to speak, but I just cognizant of the fact that we're behind time in terms of our next delegate.
My last comment, Mr. Warden, and I'll end it, is maybe there's a partnership between the lower tiers. I know in Markdale, the fire department and the ambulance services are in the same building. So maybe that's just a solution that we all work together. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So with that said, Andrew, I thank you. Kevin, thank you very much as well. And I need a motion for the committee of the whole to rise and report to council. So moved by Councillor Robinson and seconded by Councillor Milne. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. So we are going to, is our guest online? Yes, he is. Mr. Longo. There he comes. Hi, good morning, sir.
Good morning, Warden and council members. My name is Leo Longo. I'm a lawyer with Airden Burles, and I'm here speaking on behalf of my client, the municipality of West Grey, concerning OPA 11 that is before you today, which was deferred from the previous meeting. I want to be clear to council that what West Grey seeks is the removal of items 7 and 47 from OPA number 11, but otherwise has no concern with the balance of that amendment proceeding to adoption today. There are 3 points I'd like to submit on behalf of my client and the request that they are making. The first is that the items that I've asked be deleted from the official plan in our respectful submission do not fall within the purpose of OPA 11. Neither the notice that went out to the public or the document itself that sets out the purpose speaks to creating new secondary plan areas within West Grey. The notice and purpose sections state there are 2 principal reasons for OPA 11. One was to make changes to update your official plan with new population and employment numbers arising out of the county's growth management study update. That was purpose 1. And purpose 2 was to make housekeeping matters to fix discrepancies, clarify policies, or correct mapping errors. It's conceded in the staff report that the two secondary plan areas proposed in West Gray arise from neither of those purposes, but arose from growth management work that Hanover itself had done, and with the greatest of respect, appear to be hitching that to the OPA 11 wagon and hoping that county council will take that up and include these two secondary plan areas in OPA 11. My point number one is that the purpose of this amendment was not to include that or permit that. And for that reason, I would ask that items 7 and 47 be deleted. The second reason for my submission is that in the past, when this county has dealt with designating lands in West Gray as a result of Hanover's request for added commercial area, Hanover and West Gray worked together and collaboratively and made a joint application to the county to amend the county plan, which ultimately led to OPA 122, creating new commercial lands in West Gray in proximity to Hanover. That process worked well. Hanover and West Gray worked cooperatively. They applied, they filed all the supporting materials together, and the county endorsed it. That's what we're saying ought to be the process for these two new areas that Hanover wishes to add. They've done their study and they've identified those areas. Allow for West Gray to have a dialogue with Hanover about that and determine how everyone's interests are being protected, and allowing then for a joint application to come back to you with the request for those future areas. So you've established a process in the past between these two municipalities. It's worked well. It should be replicated in this instance and not added to 11 when one of the municipalities is objecting to it. And the third and final point in support of my submission is that there is no prejudice in granting the request of deleting 7 and 47 from OPA 11. There's no urgency with designating the secondary plan areas. This is not to serve any short or midterm goal. At most, this is a very long-term horizon year prospect for this official plan, and there's simply no reason to jam this one through as part of 11 when it should be done in a more collaborative way between the municipalities. So, Mr. Warden and councillors, it's my respectful request that you move 11 forward and adopt it without 7 and 47. Two options I believe you have is to one, to simply delete them and say those are not part of this amendment, and we will require that they be processed discreetly as a separate item and moving it forward in that way. The alternative, if that's not acceptable to you, is simply deferring any decision on 7 and 47, but otherwise adopting 11 and making a non-decision as it pertains to those items. There was also correspondence I filed at the last council meeting on September 20, which addresses the issue that I've addressed partially. And there was also a submission from the West Gray CAO dated September 22. I'd ask that those be considered as part of this deputation. Be pleased to answer any questions that you or any council members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Are there any questions from council members? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and thank you, Mr. Longo, for your delegation. Very much appreciated. Just for clarity, could the clerk or CAO confirm that the September 21st, 2022 correspondence from CAO Laura Johnston, a CAO of West Gray, and also the correspondence dated September 20th, 2022 from Mr. Longo have been received at the county and also circulated to members of council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. I will confirm that that correspondence was received by the county, and it was and will be today summarized along with all of the other comments that have been received regarding OPA 11.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. And just for the record, in my last discussion at County Council, I did identify both pieces of correspondence. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, County Council. Just following up with Mr. Longo on OPA 122 process, and what was the date on that? I may have missed it or whatever, but when was that processed?
122, as I have it, was adopted on April of 2014.
And just to follow up that, when was it initiated? That as well.
If you'll provide me with a moment, I have a staff report.
Scott, do you have the answer to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Warden, and thank you for your question, Deputy Warden McQueen. So OPA 122 was initiated in 2013. It was adopted in 2014. It was appealed by the Magwood Family Farms and their solicitor, Denise Baker, and then minutes of settlement were approved by the Ontario Municipal Board in 2015. That was the process there.
Councillor McQueen, you're good. Okay. All right. I don't see any other hands. So with that said, I'll thank you very much, Mr. Longo, for your time.
Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Okay, so council, I wonder if it's not, bear with me 1 second. I'm suggesting maybe we take a break. We've been sitting for over an hour. Yeah. I'm going to suggest that we take even a 10-15 minute break. Let's take 15. And we'll come back at 25 past, and then we'll make a motion to go into closed session when we return. Okay, so we'll see you back here again, I guess, at 11:25. Thank you very much. I'll call us back to order. I'm looking for a motion to put us into closed meeting, that the committee of the whole does now go into closed session pursuant to section 239(2) of the Municipal Act 2001 as amended to discuss official plan amendment number 11 with respect to litigation or potential litigation, and number 2, advice that's subject to solicitor and client privilege. I need a mover, please. Moved by Councillor Clumpus and seconded by Councillor Desai. All in favor? Is there anyone opposed? That's scary.